My speech starts in three, two, and one. On opposition, we strongly believe that Indonesia should not adopt a student loan mechanism at this stage. Firstly, we would like to clarify that the opposition is not against accessible education for tertiary education. Instead, we heavily support it. But we do disagree with the proposition's proposal to adopt a student loan system in Indonesia. Because while we understand that the proposition's intention is to make uh, tertiary education as accessible as possible, we believe that implementing this large-scale debt-based tuition fee system in Indonesia right now is extremely risky because the proposition proposed mechanism relies heavily on assumptions rather than guarantees. They assume that the job market will improve quickly, that repayment will go smoothly, and that the government administration will work efficiently and sustainably to ensure that this program is up and running, and that the financial burden on students will remain manageable for them to be able to repay back. However, these improvements take time and they remain uncertain, and they heavily depend on structural conditions that Indonesia simply does not yet fully possess. Thus, our side will prove three main things today, which is first that student loan creates immediate financial and psychological pressure on the youth, and second that Indonesia's current economic and employment conditions are not stable enough to sustain the system safely, and third that proposition has failed to prove how Indonesia can realistically implement this mechanism without developing similar structural problems that are seen in other countries that implement the student loan system. Firstly, we believe that the student loans create anticipatory financial pressure on the youth even before repayment begins. And even if proposition argues that this repayment will only start after the student is employed, the burden of debt still exists psychologically from the very beginning, from before repayment even begins, because students will uh, constantly carry the awareness that they owe money to either the government or the financial institutions that they owe money to, and this can heavily influence the way they approach adulthood and their future careers. Instead of really exploring careers based on passion and uh, long term fulfillment or their talent that they know of, students may feel pressured to prioritize jobs that uh, purely based on salary just in order to escape the debt that is the student loans as quickly as possible as they can after they graduate. This creates a generation of youth who are financially anxious and insecure from the very start of adulthood. Furthermore, this pressure becomes even worse in Indonesia's current economic climate, where stable fresh graduate employment is not guaranteed immediately upon graduation. Therefore, proposition cannot simply assume that the debt will remain manageable for Indonesian youth. Secondly, we believe that Indonesia's current economic and structural conditions are not yet prepared for a nationwide student loan mechanism. The proposition argues that because the government itself gives out the loan, then the government will be incentivized to improve the job market in order to secure repayment from the student loans that they give to the students. However, this argument relies heavily on the future assumptions rather than the guarantees, on optimistic ideals instead of the present guarantees that we can think of today. Because improving wages and employment rates and economic stability takes time. It takes a lot of time. So, what happens to the batches of students who already enroll the student loan system before those economic improvements actually occur? Because these graduates may already carry debt while struggling within an unstable job market that is not yet capable of welcoming them or absorbing them properly, or like giving them the payment that they need in order to pay off this debt. And this creates a dilemma for the government themselves, actually, because if on one hand, if the government still forces repayment despite weak employment conditions, then students suffer under severe financial pressure, and it can lead to severe financial problems and other problems for the students. However, on the other hand, if repayment becomes delayed because graduates remain unemployed or financially unstable, then the national budget itself may suffer because the government has already spent large sums of money funding this mechanism, expecting immediate repayment returning into the system, but they can't because of how unstable the economy is, and the fact that these students can't repay them immediately. Therefore, Proposition's proposed mechanism creates financial risk regardless of the outcome. Thirdly, we believe that Indonesia is not yet structurally prepared to safely normalize a large scale debt culture among the youth. In the Indonesian context, it is already common. In fact, there are hundreds of cases where we see families trapped in debt due to irresponsible financial behavior, including online gambling or online loans. This demonstrates that Indonesia still struggles with financial literacy and responsible debt management on a societal level, on a large scale, on a large basis. And it is very normalized. Thus, introducing a large scale student debt system to young citizens who are still financially vulnerable and have weak financial literacy is extremely risky, both for the individuals and also for the wider economy of Indonesia. And this becomes even more concerning because Proposition has not yet clearly explained the safeguards necessary to prevent this system from developing larger structural problems over time, like seen in other countries. The Proposition attempted to distance themselves from the failure that is the United States student loan system. However, we believe this avoidance is unfair because the student loan mechanisms themselves were heavily popularized by the United States model of the system. And even if Proposition turns towards other countries like Singapore, who has successfully implemented the system, the burden still falls on the Proposition to prove how Indonesia can realistically replicate the favorable conditions that allow Singapore's system to function successfully, that Indonesia needs to be able to replicate the system. Because Singapore and Indonesia differ heavily. They differ in the economic stability, how efficient the government is, the financial literacy, the population scale, and also fresh graduate employment conditions. Therefore, Proposition cannot simply assume that a system functioning successfully elsewhere, such as in Singapore, will automatically function safely and successfully within Indonesia. Ultimately, opposition wins this debate from the fact that Proposition's proposed mechanism depends on assumptions and ideal future conditions, while students and the state itself bear immediate and very real risks from implementation. Educational accessibility is important. Of course, we are all aware of that. And opposition acknowledges that, but accessibility achieved through a structurally unstable debt mechanism may only ultimately create a larger long-term financial insecurity for both students and for the government. Therefore, we proudly stand on opposition and we oppose the adoption of student loans in Indonesia. Thank you.